I'm very excited for us to get this kicked off. We already heard some amazing things on the first panel to help build a little bit of context on the emerging field of standards and the staking space, and now those needs have evolved. As a quick introduction, my name's Schmiedt. I'm the CEO and co-founder at Alluvial. I've been working in this space for the last couple of years. I have been very involved with a number of different standards, whether on the legal side, supporting things like the Brooklyn project back in 2018, to helping develop, specifications around risk tolerance and failure modes within the staking space through the work on DVT. And then most recently, in the context of liquid collectives, the development of various standards, including the work that we're doing on NORS, which is fundamentally part of our DNA. So if you think about liquid collectives work today to help standardize and bring participants together, taking a collaborative approach to standard development is part of our guiding principles. And so it's been incredibly exciting to get new participants in the fold to help contribute to this effort. I think needless to say, standards are incredibly important, especially in an evolving space like the crypto ecosystem, where driving better reliability, bringing new participants into the fold, and building confidence in secure innovation is incredibly important to drive the space forward. And so, as we heard from a few participants on the previous panel on how these standards are emerging in the ecosystem and what those needs are, now I'm very excited to bring in to the fold a few folks that help make these a reality and then help provide the right attestations and the right value to bring these standards to life. And so I'm really excited to be joined by Carey and Eric, and I'll give you guys a moment to introduce yourselves.
Do you want to go first? Thank you. Hi, I'm Carey Carpenter. I'm a partner with PwC based in San Francisco. I'm part of the assurance practice of PwC, which means I work on financial statement audits, SOC 1, SOC 2. I'm also a blockchain and digital asset specialist for PwC on the national office team. And I get to work with a lot of really cool clients, some crypto native startups, wallets, custodians, exchanges. I'm working with some of the spot ETF issuers. Also working with like an NFT issuer, a crypto miner, so a lot of really fun things that I get to do there in that role.
Hi everybody, my name is Eric Ray. I'm a partner with the KPMG office in Canada. Similar to Carey, I also work in a similar spot. We call it a little bit differently, but I get to work as an IT audit partner on the financial statement side, as well as specific reports like the ones that you mentioned, where the underlying subject is specifically IT. I've been with KPMG for about 10 years, and I have a global role as the IT Attest leader for blockchain in these type spaces.
Awesome. It's incredibly to see this kind of intersection of the audit world and the emerging digital asset space. And maybe before we get into the meat of it, I'd love to hear how you got into the space and what brought you there.
Good question. So the pandemic happened and the world was hard. So in San Francisco, I was living in my house, working remotely, and I started working on this company called Coinbase as part of their IPO. And I just went really far down the rabbit hole because it was a lot more fun listening to crypto podcasts and learning about blockchain technology than like watching the news or being kind of in the world that we were. So that's kind of how it started at the beginning.
For myself, many years ago, I won't tell you how many, when I started out doing audit, I was at its core a software auditor. So I would audit things like lottery draw machines to prove whether or not the machine was generating random numbers that were actually random. And then things sort of moved along with cloud environments and then finally came into crypto assets, because as its core, although very, very complicated software, it still starts from software and trying to prove that the software does what it's supposed to do.
Awesome. That's super helpful context on how we got there. But I think now one thing that I would really love to get your guys' perspective on as experts in the field is really understanding the role of audits and attestations in the space. I think maybe we'll start with you, Carey, just to get your perspective, but why do you think that shared metrics and shared standards are important criteria, both for the development of the digital asset ecosystem as well as the staking space specifically?
Yeah, I think the last panel did a great job actually covering this topic, talking about the requirements around due diligence when you start to serve a new institutional type of customer. Also talking about the comparability and the need for that comparability and a common baseline. I think the audit aspect comes in as an independent validator of the assertions that you're making as a node operator to say, yeah, we're a third party, we're independent, we've looked at what this node operator is doing, we're giving our own opinion, we're putting our name, our brand, our trust behind that node operator to say you are operating in accordance with this standard. And it is part of the professionalization of the industry that the last panel had just talked about as well.
Excellent. Yeah, I think this concept of having qualified assessments is something that we, within the context of Liquid Collective and also the NORS efforts, find unique in bringing on auditors and assessors as part of this effort. Eric, could you give us a little bit more context on what role the assurance reports play in the context of the NORS certification and why it is also important to have that kind of documentation to support its efforts?
Sure. I think to answer your question, there probably needs a bit of a comparison between what Carey and I typically talk about when we talk about assurance reports and what you may commonly see in the industry is more in the vein of an assessment. And it's not to say that assessments are bad and assurance reports are good, but they are different. And typically we would see organizations, and we see this all the time in blockchain as well as cybersecurity, pursue an assessment, which is for the most part a consulting engagement. And there's good value within a consulting engagement, but often it lacks certain properties that Carey and I have to undertake when we do an audit, for lack of a better word. And one of the reasons why there's such rigor behind an audit is because there is quite a bit of professional and personal liability to Carey and I when we are signing these documents, and we can't contract that away. So I guess in summary what I'm trying to say is that when you do an assessment report, you may be coming to an answer that's fairly valuable. But for the most part, the people doing that assessment report are likely believing what they are being told. And so you come to a narrative where the report is useful, it has useful insight, and what's in there is probably accurate, more likely than not. But that doesn't jive in our world. So in our world, we test everything. And just because you're telling us or showing us, it doesn't mean that it's true. And so we're much more in the beyond all reasonable doubt, this is correct. And you can imagine when we talk about institutions, Carey just mentioned it, we're talking about a world in which you have an organization who has a significant amount of risk. They also have a very high degree of reliance on an organization that they likely have very limited knowledge around what's being done, and they have even less control over you. But remember, they have very significant risk. And so they turn to an audit report. In the absence of the audit report, you can imagine now why they're asking 600 questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in many ways as an industry, and I think most folks that have been working in the staking space are familiar with this, we've relied heavily on self-reporting when it comes to providing context on key management or security practices. And that's been a really effective bottoms-up approach to support some of this. But as we think about this qualified assessment, as we think about this assurance report, could you talk a little bit more about what makes it unique and what aspects it covers that are different from what you guys have seen previously? And maybe we start with Carey on this topic.
Yeah, so it gets really to what is the purpose or the objective of the report. So we have existing reports today, like a SOC 1 report, really designed for internal controls over financial reporting. And if you're a service provider who's doing transaction processing or some kind of financial activity for an organization, that's the right vehicle to report. We have a SOC 2 report, it's more around technology controls as a technology service provider, very extensive standard. You can select some of the aspects of what your SOC 2 will cover, but it's not a very flexible standard, it's more prescriptive. So it says as a SOC 2, here's what we're looking for in terms of a control set that we expect you to have in place. And it's hard to customize that to what are the objectives that a node operator might be trying to achieve for a platform customer or for the end users of that platform. And we start to get into really specific risks around operating a node. How do I make sure it's resilient? How do I make sure I have the right uptime? How do I avoid slashing? How do I have the right infrastructure? All the way to getting to something like a MEV relay monitoring control. That's not something you'd ever see in a SOC 2 report, and that's why the NORS standard is a different standard to be more specific and unique for that reporting purpose.
Excellent. And I think that's probably also good comparative, because a lot of folks will be familiar inadvertently with the works of SOC and also implementing them within their organizations. Eric, one thing that I'm curious about, we actually spoke about this just before we stepped in here, but as you think about this work of taking on these assessments and kind of as an additive element even to some of the more standardized certifications like a SOC 1 or SOC 2, what does that really mean for the professionalization of our industry? Does this feel like a moment where things do feel like they're changing, and as a result we're bringing in new participants, ecosystem players, and also creating the space for them to operate and participate?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, firms like Carey and ours, we like industry standards. And I think one way to think of it is that, it's never going to be perfect. There can never be an industry standard that covers every single situation. That being said, though, what we like is the fact that the industry has come together and decided that this is what's most important to you. In the absence of this, we end up getting assurance reports or other activities, and many of you will probably know, and it was mentioned on the previous panel. So you've got 600 questions, and they're all slightly different. And it's because they're making up these questions, and they're trying to serve a purpose for just their own organization, because there's no guidance in an industry about what is typically seen. And we like that. So if that's what's happening, and of course that is what's happening with NORS, then that's something that everybody can get behind, including, as I mentioned, that potentially nebulous third party, the one who has all the risk and then is relying on you. They can start to get comfort as well.
Absolutely. And maybe this is also a good opportunity to get a bit more specific about maybe the risks that are covered within NORS and some of the aspects and considerations of that as part of the risk and evaluation framework.
Sure. So I think I mentioned some of the specific risks, but it's really around how do we control like anti-slashing, and there's some experts in the room that are going to be much better at talking about this than I am. But how do I avoid a slashing event? How do I avoid double signing? How am I doing block construction? How am I making sure that if I have a failover and a recovery that I don't end up in a double signing situation? And every node operator, can consider different uses of technology. Maybe you're thinking about DVT. You'll have your own unique response to the risks around slashing, around managing your infrastructure, managing your recovery. These risks you'll need to tailor. What is it that I'm doing as a node operator? Do I care about client diversity? Do I want different execution clients, consensus clients? Am I doing that for my own resilience, or am I doing that to support the health of the network? Or maybe both. Maybe I'm altruistic and I think it's a good practice for me to have that diversity of clients. Also thinking just about regionalization, like where am I operating my systems? Am I operating on-premise or off-premise? Am I using a cloud provider? What's my backup system? So these are some of the unique aspects of NORS that are very custom to the risks that we're trying to address around resilience, anti-slashing, recoverability, the performance, the uptime.
That's great, and I think really also comprehensive as a perspective. We do have a few operators in the room today, and so Eric, as one of the qualified assessors for NORS, what can operators do to prepare for a NORS standard or certification?
Well, so obviously you would want to take a look at the NORS standard, and in the NORS standard there's a listing of objectives. I'm going to call them control objectives. That's what they are. And as Carey just mentioned, you've got this list of control objectives. What would be the risk specific to your organization for achieving those control objectives? The phrasing would be, what would happen to prevent you from achieving those control objectives? And if you know what that is specific to your environment, and I'm sure you will, then you're going to need to establish controls, whether they be policies and procedures, whether they be technology, whether they be working with third parties. However you get there, you're going to need to establish controls to mitigate those risks. So control objective, risk that you're not going to get there, and then control to mitigate the risk. And once you got to that point, you're probably ready to call Carey or I, and we could talk a little bit about readiness assessments, which may or may not be necessary. So like learning how to drive. So you'll probably know whether or not you need some lessons or not before you call us, but a readiness assessment is certainly helpful. And then finally, you get more into the audit narrative, and you're going to feel like you were audited. I think that's fair to say. And we really look at it from three angles. The design angle. Did you build controls that Carey or I believe are sufficient? At least on paper, this would work. The implementation narrative, did you actually do it? So you may have it on paper, but you actually have to install it and actually operate it. And that operation narrative is the final narrative. And to get to the operating side, in almost all cases, you need a period of time. So it's not going to be enough to write, for example, a policy and tell people about it. We're going to check whether or not you're actually following the policy, as an example.
Absolutely. So call Carey and Eric if you want to chat a little bit more about that. I think I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the future. So, and I'd love to hear from both of you about this. How do you see NORS evolving over time, and how do you see the Ethereum ecosystem adopting some of these new measures and metrics in the future?
Yeah, so NORS was built by a fantastic working group of a lot of industry participants who brought different perspectives and some really interesting conversations along the way around what makes sense and what's the best way to manage risks. And also decisions that were made around what's important for this version 1 of the standard and what maybe is on the table for a future version of the standard. And then also considerations around where are the node operators today? Are they already issuing other types of control assurance reports like a SOC 1 and a SOC 2? There is some overlap between like a SOC 2 and the NORS standard today. Some of that's by design because some of the security controls that are in NORS are so important. We don't want to just rely on the possibility of a SOC 2 report. We want to address it in the NORS report. Private key management is very specifically called out in the NORS report because of its importance in this space. But I could see an evolution to where eventually a node operator might have a SOC 2 plus, which is one report that covers sort of the traditional SOC 2 controls, but then the plus is like an appendix with the NORS standard behind it. So you can have one report that really covers both aspects, a little broader coverage of your business. So I see the report itself evolving maybe to that other format in the future.
And I agree absolutely with what was just said. The only other thing I'll add is that I do suspect, although I don't have any inside knowledge on this, that other blockchains, currently the certification or the design of NORS is primarily focused on Ethereum, but depending on how the market goes, others I think could follow a similar, if not the same standard, with just probably a few word tweakings.
Awesome. That's super helpful context, and we're equally excited to see the standard evolve with the working group participants and the expansion of feedback from folks across the industry who have the right subject matter expertise to help drive things forward and iterate on the standard over time. I think to close things out, I would just love to hear you guys meet with an incredible range of crypto companies on a daily basis. You see the space evolve firsthand with the clients and partners that you interact with. What do you see for the future of the institutionalization of the space and crypto in specific?
Yeah, and the last panel covered this, so I appreciate some of the comments that were made there. I think we're all waiting for the approval in the United States for staking for the spot ETF products. It will be such a change specific to NORS and the node operators. Optimistic, it's hard to predict when that will happen. I see a lot of my traditional financial institution clients, they want to be involved in the space. They have regulatory prohibitions against it. They're operating, where they can do so. So we're seeing things like tokenization. We're seeing interest in stable coins and obviously the ETF issuers themselves. But they're definitely wanting to play. Also, a lot of the investors already heavy into the space, heavy into staking, and probably a lot of your customers already today. So I think we're going to continue to see, forward progress in the United States. Obviously, the election might play a big role in what's going to happen in the near term.
I agree again with everything, particularly on the ecosystem side. So maybe I'll talk more on the audit and assurance side. I certainly see this stabilized a little bit from where it was a couple of years ago. The clients that we have, they seem to have a pretty good understanding of what a crypto asset is and how to recognize revenue on their income statement being derived from crypto asset activities. We haven't had a lot of changes in the actual auditing of those traditional financial narratives for a while. And I suspect that that's going to be the case going forward, as long as someone doesn't invent something new and unique, which always happens, and that's okay. And on the assurance side, again, the standards that Carey and I are using, they haven't changed for a long time either. So I hesitate to say that we're actually entering a period of a little bit of stability. Again, of course, subject to the US election. But that said, like what we've got here today and what we've been talking about, these are things that are relatively stable, which large institutions like. And so we go down this path, and I suspect the adjustments that we'll make will be based on feedback that we get, but those will be done more on a yearly basis as opposed to changing every month.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you both for pioneering in the space and for all the work and contributions you guys have driven towards the standard. Please find Carey and Eric around for the rest of the event, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.